from New Hampshire.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to join my colleagues in expressing my clear and unequivocal support for a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution, Senate Resolution 10. With our out-of-control and unsustainable debt threatening nothing less than the American dream and the opportunities that will be available for our children and our grandchildren, we need to pass a meaningful, balanced budget amendment, and this, in my view, would want to be one of the most single important steps that we could take to get America's fiscal house in order and to save our country from looming insolvency. Madam President, 49 states in this country have some requirement to balance their budget, and the federal government should be no different. My home state of New Hampshire has a legal requirement to balance its budget and has long followed this common sense tradition of fiscal responsibility. This is a subject that I've discussed extensively with my constituents over the last year while I've done town hall meetings throughout our state focusing on our nation's debt crisis. I've done a PowerPoint presentation to show my constituents the hard numbers on the fiscal state of this country, and it's deeply troubling where we are today. 3 straight years of $1 trillion plus deficits, over $15 trillion in debt, Medicare, Social Security on a path to insolvency as early as 2024 and 2036, respectively. And nearly half of our debt, 47%, currently being held by foreign entities, and the single biggest foreign holder of our debt is China. I also talk about spending and deficits in terms of how it relates to your average New Hampshire family. And in New Hampshire, if you used Washington's budgeting logic, where we are borrowing 40 cents of every single dollar, in 2008, the New Hampshire median family household income was $66,000. And if you used Washington logic, the amount that family would spend would be $107,000, or $41,000 more than they earned. That would never fly in New Hampshire, where families sit around their kitchen tables and they use their common sense to balance their budget. Yet in Washington, we continue to perpetuate this borrowing to sustain our government every day. And if you look at where we are, one of the most troubling statistics that really impacts our economic growth is the share of our gross debt to the size of our economy, or our GDP, is now 100%. Just 5 years ago, that ratio was closer to 60%. As many of us in this chamber are aware, economists Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff have concluded in a study that over the past centuries, nations who reach where we are, where total debt reaches over 90% of the size of our economy, there is a negative impact on economic growth, and we can expect lower job growth and fewer economic opportunities. We certainly cannot afford that in this time, troubling time for Americans. And so not only do we need to get our fiscal house in order because it's the right thing to do, so we aren't dependent on other countries like China to fund our government, but also we need to do it so that we can provide opportunities for future generations of Americans. New Hampshire citizens understand that we can't keep spending money that we don't have. They make those common sense decisions on their own family budgets. Small business owners in New Hampshire, they're astounded when I tell them that our federal government is operating without a budget, because they would never run their business without a budget. But they don't understand why Congress can't even perform such a basic function of passing a budget blueprint. And Madam President, it's now been 958 days since the Senate last passed a budget. And I have to say, I was really honored and excited to be the newest appointment to the Senate Budget Committee. However, I've been incredibly disappointed that we have not, in that committee, done the hard work that needs to be done, the thing that is right for this country, to sit down, to make the hard choices, to put together a budget blueprint, and to pass a Senate budget, to have the robust debate on the Senate floor about how we prioritize our spending and how we live within our means. The American people deserve better. They deserve us to do our jobs and to pass a budget for our country that is fiscally responsible. And in that time, in those 958 days that the Senate has not passed a budget, the nation's debt has increased by $3.9 trillion. You think about it, it's deeply troubling, and I'm hopeful that if we bring forward and pass the requirement of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, it will also force Congress to do the basic function of putting together a responsible and balanced budget for our country. I cannot emphasize enough the urgency of passing this budget control measure, the balanced budget amendment, Senate Resolution 10. And I think it's important for my constituents and the American people to know, if we pass a balanced budget amendment in this body and in the Congress, this is putting the question to you, to the American people, to decide, do you want the federal government to balance its budget? So when we pass an amendment to the Constitution, we are simply sending along to the states the decision of should we amend our Constitution. And I can't think of anything more important than sending that question to the American people, to our state legislatures to decide, should we live within our means? Should we be bound by the same requirements that the states have, by that same common sense that we find at home, to balance our budget and live within our means? So, Madam President, for fiscal year 2011, we spent 24.1% of our gross domestic product. And that is well above the historical spending average of a little over 18%, if you go back to 1960, of where the revenue we have had has come in. And so we are at a huge trajectory of spending at 24.1%, and yet in 2011, our revenues only counted for 15.4% of our economy because of the difficult time we find ourselves in right now relative to our economic growth. And under the Republican proposed balanced budget amendment, we put the handcuffs in place that are needed to put us on a path to eliminate this red ink by capping federal spending at the historical level of revenue at 18%. And why is this important? It's important because we can't continue to spend well beyond our means. And we have to acknowledge that a meaningful balanced budget amendment will also cap federal spending at its historical levels. It isn't difficult to see what will happen if we don't get control of our fiscal situation right now. Budget shortfalls will only get much worse, driven by massive increases in entitlement spending and interest payments. And the reality is that the failure to act will result in America going the way of what we see happening in Europe right now, the way of Greece, of Italy, and Ireland, our economy in tatters, and our standard of living greatly diminished. And we cannot let that happen to our country. We must act now. We must pass this balanced budget amendment in the Senate and send that question on, and in the House, and also send that question along to the states so the people of this country can decide, should we be responsible here and have to balance our budget? Left unchanged, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and other mandatory health programs alone will eventually grow to consume every single dollar of the revenue that our government takes in. Without reform, The Social Security trustees project that the program will be insolvent by 2036. And as a result, beneficiaries will see a benefit cut of 23% in just 25 years. The Medicare trustees, it's even more immediate and dire. The Medicare trustees project that Medicare will be insolvent by the year of 2024. It doesn't have to be that way. We need to show the political will and courage to reform these programs, to make them sustainable, and to reform them and preserve them for those like my grandparents who are relying on them, and for future generations to know that these programs will be there. But if we fail to take this challenge on now and continue to kick the can down the road, then these programs will be greatly diminished, and they'll continue on an unsustainable path that's bankrupting our country. Madam President, in this debate, it's important to remember that in 1997, the Balanced Budget Amendment failed to pass this body by only one vote. And at that time, our national debt stood at $5.4 trillion. We now have $15 trillion of debt, and that debt equates to about $128,000 per household. That is a huge amount of money to your average household. And under the Budget Control Act, which I opposed last August, the debt will be allowed to reach a new limit of $16.4 trillion left unchecked. Congress has raised the debt limit 79 times since 1960, and in just 4 short months since the debt limit was last increased, over $700 billion has been added to our debt since we took that act in August. Speaking of the debt limit, the Republican-backed Balanced Budget Amendment will require a congressional supermajority to raise the debt ceiling. That means that 3/5 of both chambers will have to approve unless it is a time of war, and that would require a majority in a time of war. That's a very important measure because we can't continue to increase the debt limit without addressing the underlying drivers of this fiscal crisis that faces our country. I'd also like to briefly touch on taxes. The Republican version of the Balanced Budget Amendment, Senate Resolution 10, would require a supermajority to raise tax rates. Madam President, we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Under Senate Resolution 10, a 2/3 approval of both houses of Congress would be required for any bill that imposes a new tax or increases the statutory rate of any tax or the aggregate amount of revenue. Madam President, my friends on the other side of the aisle are proposing an alternative, Senate Resolution 24, to the Balanced Budget Amendment that I've just described. While this proposal sounds good, it fails to squarely address the magnitude of the challenges that we face. It doesn't apply to all spending. It also doesn't contain a cap on spending. It does nothing to strengthen our entitlement programs, and it does nothing to make it harder to raise taxes. It does nothing to make it more difficult to raise the debt ceiling, and in my view, it is insufficient to be meaningful to pass along to the states for a vote. And the Republican alternative contains the elements that I just talked about: a balanced budget, spending caps, a supermajority to raise taxes, and making it more difficult to raise the debt ceiling unless and until we address the underlying causes of our fiscal crisis. Madam President, this issue is deeply personal for me. I fundamentally believe that all of us have a duty to make this country stronger than we found it. As the mother of 2 young children, Catherine, who's now 7, Jacob, who's 4 years old, who are all very excited for Christmas, I want the American dream to burn as brightly for them as it has for me. It's not too late for our country or for this body to make the tough decisions that will put our country on a fiscally responsible path. And I feel a solemn duty to make sure that we make those choices now and we don't continue to kick this can down the road for future generations and burden them with a debt that they did not incur. The last thing I want is for my children to ask me, "Mom, you knew we were going bankrupt. What did you do to save our country?" Madam President, now is the time for courage. All of us recognize the enormity of the fiscal challenges that we face, as well as the dire cost of continued inaction in this body. The Republican Balanced Budget Amendment provides a solid foundation that will set our nation on a fiscally responsible path. This is an urgent need that we have right now. We cannot do what we did in 1997 and fail to pass the Balanced Budget Amendment. We should send this question to the states and let them decide, let the people of this country decide, should we live within our means? Should we balance our budget? Should we deal with this debt crisis now and make sure that my children and all children and our grandchildren will have the same opportunities that we have been blessed to have in the greatest country on earth? Thank you, Madam President. I urge my colleagues to support Senate Resolution 10.